Hello, this is the last video this week, which I'm sure you're all sort of relieved to hear. So far you should have seen a video on measurements of macro performance, so looking at economic growth, unemployment, inflation, trade, and with the acronym digestive. You've hopefully watched two videos on demand side policies, so one on fiscal and one on monetary policy. So different things that we can do to influence the level of aggregate demand. What we need to do in this final video is to look at two historical time periods. We're going to be looking at something we call the Great Depression, and then we're going to be looking at something we call the financial crisis. Now the Great Depression occurred or started in 1929. The financial crisis started in 2008. Now, what these two are, the Great Depression and the financial crisis, are probably the two most famous recessions that have occurred, especially in recent times, in global economies. Now, the Great Depression was a 1929 started recession. Now, the difference between a recession and a depression is that a recession is measured by at least 2 3-month periods of negative economic growth. So if GDP falls for at least 6 months, you have a recession. A depression is where you have a sustained and deep recession. So to give you an idea, during the Great Depression that started in 1929 and lasted really for the best part of a decade across the world, look at some of the impacts. The global GDP fell by 15%. International trade fell by 50%, and across the world unemployment skyrocketed. Some economies 23%, other economies it went as high as 33%, and what this did was it led to a massive growth in global poverty. Now what we need to think about is what caused the Great Depression to happen, and then what did we do, or what did governments and central banks do to try and sort out some of these problems. Right, now first things first, what I've drawn here is a classical long-run aggregate supply. Now if you think about a business cycle, you've got a recovery, you're going into a high period of economic growth, that then booms, and then it downturns, moving into a recession. Now look at this, 1920s in America were boom time. The economy and lots of economies across the world were literally booming. 1920s was a period where big economies had moved out of World War I and they were moving into what we call the Roaring 20s, so economies were booming. And the reason why in the 1920s, especially in America, you had the big growth in consumerism. So you had Ford producing mass-produced cars, you had washing machines and radios and toasters and fridge freezers becoming available for people to buy. And that led to a big explosion in consumption and fueled lots and lots of economic growth in the 1920s in America. Now, because of that big boom time, you had lots of jobs being created and people started to become very, very wealthy. Now, what you found was that in those boom times, animal spirits or confidence was sky high. And people were so confident and were spending more and more and more and more. Now, what started to happen was the American stock market started to boom. So all those businesses that produced all those cars, all those toasters, all those washing machines were making big profits and offering huge dividends to shareholders. So everyone, now literally everyone, started investing into shares on the American Stock Exchange. So people that had never bought shares before were buying shares. And it got crazy, you had plumbers, bakers, normal people like you and me, investing heavily, all their life savings into the stock market. But then it got a bit crazy. Not only were people spending all their savings, some people actually took out loans to buy shares in companies. You had banks spending everyone's savings that we deposited in their banks into the stock market, and that big growth in demand for shares led to a big growth in the prices and the values of companies on the American Stock Exchange. Now what this created was a big bubble where share prices were going up that quickly that you had herding behaviour, people jumping on the bandwagon, buying more and more shares. And that meant the share prices kept on growing and growing and growing. And all that confidence fueled prices to keep increasing, and that kept the boom growing. But then what started to happen was a few bright spots realised, you know what, this isn't going to last. They realised the prices had grown to completely unrealistic prices. And what was happening was the American economy was actually starting to slow down. So the share prices were up here, but the real values were down here. So what happened was people started selling, and we had panic selling of shares across America, and share values plummeted in value. And that meant that billions of dollars were wiped off the value of all these different shares, and people lost their life savings. Banks had lost everyone's savings. And it got that bad that when people started to try and get their money back from the banks had no money to pay it back. They were bankrupt. They had no liquidity. So the idea was that people lost an absolute fortune. And what that did was it led to a reduction in aggregate demand. It led to another reduction in aggregate demand. And the economy was stuck in this downward cycle of falling aggregate demand. And that led to GDP falling massively. Now, this didn't just stop in America. Because of globalisation, you had investments by Americans all over the world. Foreign firms were investing into America, and this soon became a global recession where lots and lots of the world's biggest economies, including Britain, fell on really, really hard times. Now, in many ways, what made the problem even worse was this. Something we call the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. Now, the American government tried to claw back some of this bad recession, thought, you know what we'll do? We'll put big taxes on foreign goods coming into America. In other words, we'll stop the imports coming into our economy. Now, the idea is if you stop the imports coming in, it should raise aggregate demand and boost economic performance across America. It should also get more American people buying American products rather than foreign products. Well, in theory it makes sense, but it doesn't, because what then that led to is something that we call retaliation. As the American government started putting big tariffs on foreign goods and services, foreign economies thought, I tell you what, if they're doing that to us, we'll put these tariffs on their products as well. So that meant that American firms couldn't export across the world. And that meant that across the world, exporting, trade fell massively, and that made the global economy fall even worse. Now, what's really, really odd about this, though, is if you're thinking about fiscal and monetary policy, what you would now argue is that the American government and global governments across the world should have been using demand-side policies. So expansionary fiscal and expansionary monetary policy. So whacking up government spending, reducing taxes, reducing interest rates, raising money supply to give aggregate demand the boost that it would need. And the trouble was it wasn't. And the reason why is at the time, big governments across the world, they believed in the ideas of classical economics. Look at this diagram. If we're stuck in a negative output gap and you've got spare capacity, the logic will be, in a classical world, the free market economy will fix the problem. If you've got unused resources or spare capacity, over time those resources will start to become cheaper. So wage rates will start to fall. And as wage rates start to fall, that should incentivise businesses to want to invest more. And that will get the economy back towards a trend rate of economic growth. A classical economist would therefore say, you know what, if we're in a recession, we let the market fix the problem. The free market will fix excess supply and we'll get back to where we need to be. So at the time, American governments and British governments actually believed in the idea of a balanced budget. In other words, we don't use fiscal policy to influence aggregate demand. We just keep government finances simple. Whenever we get through taxes, we'll spend. Now the problem was that what the British government did was, in particular, as the economy moved into recession, it meant that the government was getting less taxes back because less people were working. So our government actually raised taxes and cut government spending to balance the budgets again. And all that did was to make the recession even worse. Now, what was really, really unusual at this time was that all these classical economists thinking, you know what, our model is not working. We believe in this idea that eventually the economy will get where we want it to, but it's not working. And it was kind of a failure of classical economics. The idea is the economy is not fixing itself. The idea should be that this is not the medicine. As the economy slumps and goes into recession, we'd realise, we made mistakes, we'd learn from them, and the free market would fix the problem, and we'd get where it would need to be. But it wasn't working. So what happened was, by 1933, still in recession, depression across America, America started to move slowly towards Keynesian economics. And this was the idea that what we had in America was something called the New Deal. And the logic would now be that the American government would massively increase government spending to boost aggregate demand and start to build up a little bit of debt. We also saw interest rates start to fall as well, and slowly these Keynesian demand side policies were starting to have the desired effects in the economy. But it wasn't really until World War II that required government to spend lots and lots of money that we had a true economic recovery. So idea, guys, Great Depression, terrible, deep, nasty recession, had some huge bad impacts on the economy, but the big governments across the world thought, you know what, the best idea is classical. We don't do anything, we let the free market fix the problem. But it led to a long, nasty depression, and it lasted for the best part of a decade or so. It's only really World War II that ended it. Now let's compare that with the financial crisis of 2008. Now, the subprime mortgage crisis is what triggered the financial crisis. Let's try and keep this as simple as we can. In the run-up to 2008, so the decade running up to 2008, house prices were shooting up massively. So because house price was shooting up so massively, it meant that we were having a bubble starting to happen again. Now the idea was we had a really sustained period of economic growth where lots and lots of people used that growth to go and buy houses. And that growing demand for houses led to a big growth in house prices across America and across the UK in particular. And as house prices started to grow, you had more spending, more wealth being generated, and the economy started to do really well. Now the problem is that when banks lend money to people to buy a house, they would like people to be prime borrowers. Now a prime borrower is somebody with good job security, good wages, and a good history of paying back credit. Now the problem was all those people had already bought a property, and banks were thinking, well, how can we carry on to make more money from people? So what they started to do was to lend to what we call the subprime borrowers. Now a subprime borrower is somebody with a poor credit history, somebody that has struggled to pay back debt in the past. So banks were now lending to what we call subprime borrowers. And the logic would be that if house prices kept on increasing, who cares? If they start defaulting on their debt, we'd take back the house off them, which is worth an absolute fortune. Now the problem is that banks didn't stop there. When they were lending to subprime borrowers, they got a bit greedy. They thought, well hang on, because we've now lent out all of our money, we have now got what we call poor liquidity. We've got no more money to lend out, so how can we get more money back to keep lending to more and more people? So what these banks were doing now was they were bundling up lots and lots of different mortgages and selling them on to investment banks. So they were literally selling on the mortgages for thousands of people at a time onto investment banks. And then what that would do, it would then put more money back into the banks, who are now free to borrow to more and more people again. Now the problem is that to get these people to take out these subprime mortgages, they were often given very good low introductory mortgage deals, really low rates of interest. Now the problem was that after a couple of years those low interest rates ended and interest payments started to go sky high. And these people suddenly couldn't afford these mortgages. But the banks weren't bothered because they'd sold on that debt to big investment banks. Now the big investment banks, the problem was they thought they bought lots of prime mortgages. They didn't know about this. So what happened was, because mortgage payments started to go up for all these people, lots of these people started defaulting on their debt. And that meant that big banks across the world and big investment banks start to lose a lot of money. Lots of big banks went bankrupt and had to be bailed out by governments. And because we didn't know which banks were safe and which weren't safe, banks wouldn't lend to each other. And this created a credit crunch, which meant that across the financial system we had really, really low or poor liquidity. Now, what this then did was, it meant that some house prices fell and people like me ended up in negative equity. And that meant that the house that we'd bought was worth less than what the mortgage was. So in effect we had negative wealth. We were more and more in debt than ever. That would kill consumption, kill investment by businesses, and again it would lower aggregate demand and lead to a negative output gap. Okay, so a bit like the Great Depression, we had a big drop in aggregate demand created by a big fall in AD. Now, under the Great Depression, the idea was classical economics. We'll let the economy fix itself. Well, this was the rise of Keynes, really. Governments across the world, particularly in America, embarked on Keynesian economics. The idea was we've just got to boost aggregate demand. So they used lots of demand-side policies. So in the UK, for example, interest rates fell from just under 6% base rates down to 0.5%. They even went down to 0.25% at one point, designed to try and push up borrowing and lending to take place. We had quantitative easing, where the central bank pumped in effect £375 billion into the circular flow. Remember, if you push more money into the system, you boost liquidity, money becomes cheaper, more people spend, and that should create more economic growth. We also used expansionary fiscal policy. So our government, for example, they cut VAT rates, which got people spending more money. Taxes are a withdrawal. If you cut the withdrawal, you're pushing more money back into the economy. But our government also massively increased government spending. So they introduced things like the Help to Buy scheme, where people could access from the government a deposit to buy a house. And that was designed to try and push back spending in the economy. They introduced things like the car scrappage scheme, where they said to people with old clapped out cars, we will give you £1,000 towards the price of a new car if you cash in your old car and upgrade, designed to try and boost demand for cars across the economy. And the logic was, you might see this working, because the Great Depression, it led to a massive drop in global GDP, trade dried up, and with a decade of austerity and poverty. The financial crisis, well, it was over in a year or so. So you could argue these policies were quite effective at getting the economy back where it needs to be. So guys, classical economics in a depression, recession, you do nothing. You let the free market fix itself like we did in the Great Depression. If you go towards 2008 and the financial crisis, it was more Keynesian economics, about using demand-side policies to give the economy a boost to tackle the negative output gaps. Right guys, that was quite technical, that one. I hope it makes sense. If it doesn't, get back to me and we'll see what we can do. Okay, cheers everyone, bye.